7 days. That's all it took. 7 days of tossing eggshells into a bucket, dropping wilted lettuce into a bin, scraping coffee grounds off a filter, and what came out the other side looked nothing like what I expected. Not a little better. Not pretty good for a week. It looked like the kind of dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling soil you'd pay $30 a bag for at a garden center. And I'm telling you right now, I had to check twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Kitchen waste. 1 week. And the result was genuinely shocking. But here's the part that nobody tells you. It wasn't just what came out. It was the process. Because somewhere in that week, I stumbled across a mechanism that most backyard composters have never heard of. Something so simple, so backed by science, and so completely absent from every "How to Compost for Beginners" video I'd ever watched that I had to stop and ask myself, why don't people know this? And I'll get to exactly what that mechanism is, but not yet. Because to understand why it works, you first need to understand just how broken the alternative is. Let's talk about your bin bags for a second. The average household in the United States throws away roughly 325 pounds of food scraps per year. Not food, scraps, peels, cores, grounds. Things that were never going to be eaten. And almost all of it goes into a plastic bag, into a truck, into a landfill, where it doesn't quietly decompose. It rots anaerobically, meaning without oxygen, and releases methane gas at a rate that, according to the EPA, makes food waste in landfills the third largest source of human-caused methane emissions in the entire country. You're not just wasting food, you're turning your kitchen scraps into a slow-burn climate problem. Meanwhile, the commercial fertilizer industry, worth over $200 billion globally, has spent decades convincing you that healthy soil comes from a bag, that those little pellets of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are what your plants need. NPK. That's it. That's the whole story, according to the companies that sell you the product. And look, NPK isn't wrong. Plants do need those elements, but it's like telling you that humans need calories, and then handing you a sugar cube and calling it nutrition. You'd technically survive, but you wouldn't thrive. What commercial fertilizers almost never restore is the biological layer, the living, breathing community of fungi, bacteria, nematodes, and microorganisms that actually make soil function. Without them, you're farming a medium, not a living system. And here's the part that stings a little. Each time you apply synthetic fertilizer without rebuilding the biology, you make the soil slightly more dependent on the next application, slightly less able to function on its own. It's a quiet feedback loop, and it's been running for about 70 years. I'm not here to rant, I'm here to show you the exit ramp. And it starts, genuinely, practically, with your kitchen waste. What I want to show you is a method that's about as far from modern industrial agriculture as you can get. It's old, and I mean old in a way that makes the Roman Empire look recent. There's evidence of intentional organic waste, composting from as far back as 10,000 BCE, specifically in ancient Mesopotamia and along the Indus Valley, where excavations have found layered pits containing ash, animal remains, and plant debris positioned deliberately near agricultural fields. Not dumped, placed. There was intention there. Someone figured out, thousands of years ago, that waste wasn't waste. But the version I want to focus on, the specific technique that made my 1-week experiment work the way it did, has its most documented origins in East Asian agricultural systems. Specifically, in a practice that Japanese and Korean smallholder farmers refined over centuries, which Western agricultural researchers only began seriously studying in the 1980s. It involves a class of microorganisms called indigenous microorganisms, IMOs, cultivated directly from your local environment, not purchased, not manufactured. They're already in the soil around you, and with the right conditions, you can recruit them to do something remarkable. The man who brought this into modern horticultural focus was a South Korean scientist and farmer named Han Kyu Cho. Working in the Janong Natural Farming Institute in the 1960s and 70s, Cho developed what he called Korean natural farming, a system of practices built almost entirely on harnessing indigenous microbiology. His results were documented, published, and replicated across Southeast Asia for decades before any Western institution paid real attention. The University of Hawaii's College of Tropical Agriculture eventually did an extensive review of his methods, and what they found was striking. Yields comparable to or exceeding conventional methods, with input costs a fraction of the commercial alternative. Stay with me here, because the reason it works is the part that's going to change how you see your kitchen bin. Here's the first mechanism, and I want you to really sit with this one. Decomposition isn't just rotting. Rotting is what happens when you have no oxygen, no microbial diversity, no management. What you want, what the best composting systems produce, is something closer to a controlled fermentation. Think of the difference between bread going stale on your counter and sourdough developing in a warm kitchen. One is collapse. The other is transformation. When the right microorganisms are present, specifically lactic acid bacteria, Photorophic bacteria, and yeast, your kitchen scraps don't just break down. They transform in a way that produces a substance that's genuinely more bioavailable to plants than the original material was in any form. The nutrients don't disappear into gas or leach away. They get locked into stable microbial biomass. And when a plant root encounters that biomass, it can access those nutrients far more efficiently than it could absorb a synthetic pellet, because the delivery system has been pre-digested, if you want to think of it that way. Phototrophic bacteria, stay with me, this is simpler than it sounds, are basically solar-powered decomposers. They can use light, including indirect light, to drive metabolic processes. They exist in the topsoil, around every tree, under every pile of leaves, in almost every healthy garden. And they are absolutely in the leaf litter and garden soil near your home right now. The trick isn't finding them. The trick is feeding them. Here's the second mechanism, and this one is the wait, what moment I promised you. When organic matter, specifically the complex carbohydrates in fruit peels, vegetable scraps, and coffee grounds, breaks down in the presence of the right microbial population, it produces humic acids. Not humus, which is a finished soil state, but humic acids, which are the actual molecular bridges between decomposed organic matter and plant-available nutrition. Think of humic acids as the translator between dead plant material and living plant roots. Without them, nutrients can sit in the soil and still be inaccessible. With them, even modest amounts of organic matter become highly leveraged sources of plant food. Commercial composting operations produce some humic acids. Landfill disposal produces essentially zero. But the method I use this week, which I'm going to walk you through in detail in a few minutes, is specifically designed to maximize humic acid production in a dramatically shorter time frame than conventional composting. We're talking days, not months, and I'll show you exactly how. But before we get there, I need to explain what most composting advice gets fundamentally wrong. Because if you've tried composting before and gotten a wet, smelly, slimy mess, this is why. And it's not your fault. It's almost never the gardener's fault. It's a systemic misunderstanding in how the method gets taught. Most beginner composting guides tell you to layer green and brown material, keep it moist, and turn it every few weeks. That's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in a way that leads to failure about 70% of the time. Here's what's missing from that advice: microbial inoculant and carbon to nitrogen management at the particle level. Microbial inoculant sounds complicated, but it's just a way of saying your compost pile needs a starter culture. Like yogurt needs a little bit of existing yogurt to get going, your pile needs a small population of the right microorganisms present from the beginning to drive fermentation in the right direction. Without it, you're waiting for random environmental colonization, which takes weeks, smells bad, and often goes anaerobic before the beneficial organisms have a chance to establish. The good news is, You can make your own inoculant for free, completely free. And I'll tell you exactly how to do that in the practical section, because it's one of the two things that made the biggest difference in my 1-week experiment. Carbon to nitrogen ratio, the C/N ratio, is the second piece. You've probably heard this mentioned before, but let me make it visceral. Carbon is structure. It's fiber, it's cardboard, it's dry leaves, it's wood chips. Nitrogen is protein. It's fresh grass clippings, it's food scraps, it's coffee grounds. Your pile needs roughly 25 to 30 parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen to stay aerobic and productive. If that ratio tips too far toward nitrogen, too many kitchen scraps, not enough dry material, the pile heats up wrong, goes anaerobic, and starts producing ammonia instead of humic acids. That's the smell. That's the failure mode. But, and here's the part most guides skip, the ratio isn't just about what you add. It's about particle size. A whole apple core has a different effective CN behavior than that same core chopped into pieces, because surface area determines how fast the microorganisms can access the material. Smaller pieces, faster colonization, faster transformation. In my 1-week experiment, I chopped everything, every single scrap. And I can tell you it made a measurable difference. Let's talk about heat, because this is where things get physically dramatic in a way that surprises people every time. A well-managed hot compost pile can reach internal temperatures between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures hot enough to pasteurize pathogens, kill weed seeds, and drive the entire decomposition process at a speed that open pile passive composting simply cannot match. You can actually feel it with your hand through a well-constructed pile. That heat is a byproduct of microbial respiration, billions of organisms metabolizing at the same time, producing heat the same way your body produces heat when you exercise. The pile is alive, measurably thermally alive. Now, here's the surprising sub-fact I mentioned earlier, and I want you to really hear this. The heat in a compost pile doesn't come from the breakdown of the material. It comes from the organisms breaking it down, which means the heat is a sign of success, not decay. A hot pile is doing exactly what you want. A cool pile, one that sits at ambient temperature and smells faintly of rot, is an aerobic failure, slowly going backwards. I've seen people stick a thermometer in their pile and panic when it reads 150 degrees. That's not a fire hazard. That's your pile performing. The only time you need to worry about heat is if it exceeds about 170 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point even the beneficial thermophilic bacteria start to struggle. But that's a rare edge case. The far more common problem is a pile that never heats up at all, because it's either too dry, too large in particle size, lacking nitrogen, or lacking the right microbial starter. Have you ever tried to compost and given up because it just sat there for 6 months and looked exactly the same? Tell me in the comments below, because I want to know how many people are starting from that exact frustration. Because what you experienced wasn't a failure of composting. It was a failure of the information you'd been given about composting. And that brings me to something I need to name directly. The reason this information is hard to find isn't corporate suppression in the dramatic sense. It's more subtle, and in some ways, more infuriating. It's cultural forgetting compounded by economic incentive. When a functional free system exists, when kitchen scraps plus the right process can replace $30 bags of fertilizer, the companies that sell those bags have no financial interest in simplifying that knowledge for you. They don't need to suppress it. They just need to make their product easier to understand than the alternative. And they've succeeded for about 70 years in doing exactly that. But the knowledge never disappeared. It was published in Korean agriculture journals. It was practiced in community gardens in Japan, in rooftop growing systems in Singapore, in small-scale farming operations across South and Southeast Asia. It was present the whole time, in the literature, in the soil. It just wasn't in the marketing budget of anyone with a television slot. That's the gap we're closing today. And I need to tell you now, before we get into the exact method, that the most powerful piece of this system is something most people in the composting world don't talk about at all. I'll get to it in about 2 minutes, right after I walk you through the setup. Because if you start the method without understanding the mechanism behind it, you're likely to skip the step that makes everything work faster. Because if you start the method without understanding the mechanism behind it, you're likely to skip the step that makes everything work faster. And that step is almost too simple to believe when you see it. So let me earn your trust on the setup first. Here's exactly what I did. And I'm going to be precise because vague composting advice is how we got here in the first place. You'll need a container. And I want to be specific about the kind. Not a rotating barrel composter. Not a wire cage open to the air. What you want for this method is a sealed or nearly sealed bin, somewhere between 5 and 15 gallons in size. A standard food-grade plastic bin with a lid works perfectly. I used a 14-gallon Rubbermaid storage tote with a few small holes drilled near the top for minimal airflow. The reason it needs to be nearly sealed is that you're not doing traditional hot composting here. You're doing accelerated bokashi-assisted fermentation, and the conditions need to stay anaerobic or semi-anaerobic during the first stage. Bokashi, the word comes from Japanese and means fermented organic matter, is the inoculant system I mentioned earlier. And here's where the magic really happens. You can purchase bokashi bran at most garden centers for around $15 to $20 for a 2-kilogram bag, which will last you months. But here's the free alternative. You can inoculate your own carrier material at home using just brown rice water, a small handful of existing garden soil, and molasses. Here's how. Rinse about 2 cups of uncooked brown rice in water, then save that cloudy rinse water. That's your starter. It's full of lactobacillus organisms and yeasts, native to your local environment. Leave it uncovered in a jar at room temperature for about 3 days. It will ferment slightly and develop a mild, slightly sour smell, like very mild vinegar or slightly off milk. That's correct. That's what you want. Then mix 2 tablespoons of that water with 1 cup of water, 1 tablespoon of unsulfured molasses, and enough wheat bran or oat bran to absorb the liquid into a slightly damp, not wet, crumbly mixture. Spread it thin on a baking sheet. Let it dry in a cool shaded spot for 24 hours, and you have homemade bokashi bran. Your total cost, under $2. Now, most people get the moisture level wrong at this stage. Your bran should feel like a wrung-out sponge, damp enough to hold its shape when you squeeze it, but not dripping. If it's too wet when you try to dry it, it will mold the wrong way. If it's too dry, the organisms won't survive. That moisture level is the single most important variable in making your own inoculant. Now for the actual kitchen waste collection. Over the 7 days, I saved everything: eggshells, citrus peels, onion skins, coffee grounds with the filter, vegetable tops and bottoms, banana peels, the cores and stems of whatever I cooked. The only things I excluded were meat and dairy. Not because they're impossible to compost this way, but because for a first run, they add complexity you don't need. Stick to plant-based kitchen scraps for your first week. Each time I added a layer of scraps to the bin, and I did this every 1 to 2 days. I sprinkled roughly 1 tablespoon of bokashi bran per inch of material, then pressed the scraps down firmly to remove air pockets and resealed the lid tightly. The pressing is important. You're creating anaerobic pockets that drive fermentation rather than putrefaction. It takes about 30 seconds. Don't skip it. By day 3, you'll notice a slightly sour, almost pickled smell when you open the lid. This is not a failure. This is fermentation working. Think of it like kimchi. It smells fermented because it is fermenting. The organisms are converting the complex sugars in your kitchen scraps into organic acids, which is exactly the chemical environment that produces those humic acids I mentioned earlier. By day 5, you may notice a light white fuzz on the surface of the material. White mycelium, fungal threads. Still not a failure. White or off-white fuzzy growth means you have the right organisms operating. The only warning color is black or green mold, which means your bin has gone the wrong direction, usually because too much moisture was present, or the bokashi bran was underapplied. On day 7, here's what you do. You have 2 options, and I want to give you both. Option 1 is the faster, more dramatic result. Take your fermented scraps, which by now should smell pickled and slightly sweet, like vinegar and fruit, and bury them directly in your garden bed at a depth of at least 6 to 8 inches. Cover them completely with soil and mark the spot. In 2 to 3 weeks, you can dig in that spot and find something that looks like dark, rich, crumbly compost, dramatically faster than the months required for traditional composting. The soil microorganisms in your garden, encountering that pre-fermented, inoculant-rich material, complete the transformation almost overnight in relative terms. Option 2, which is what I did for the most dramatic visual result, is to layer the fermented scraps into a secondary soil factory. Take a container of at least 50% garden soil mixed with your fermented material. Maintain moisture at that wrung-out sponge level. Keep it sealed in a dark space at room temperature, and wait 2 weeks. What comes out is a dark, almost chocolate-colored, earthy-smelling material with virtually no recognizable food remnants. That is finished bokashi compost, and its nutrient density per volume is genuinely startling. One independent study from the Wageningen University in the Netherlands, published in 2015, found that bokashi-composted organic matter produced plant biomass increases of up to 42% compared to the same volume of conventional mature compost. The mechanism they found was the elevated humic acid content and the significantly higher microbial diversity in the bokashi product. 42% from kitchen scraps in 2 weeks total. Now I want to tell you what to expect in real time, because expectation management is where most people fall off this method. In the first week, your active fermentation period, nothing about your bin will look like progress. It will look like a sealed container of scraps. It will smell interesting when you open it. That's all. If you're expecting to see transformation happening visually, you'll be disappointed, and you might abandon the method. The work in week 1 is invisible. It's molecular. The organisms are breaking chemical bonds you can't see, building microbial colonies you can't see, producing acids you can't see. Trust the bran. Trust the seal. In week 2, if you've gone with the soil factory method, you'll start to see something. The material will darken. The texture will become more uniform. The smell will shift from pickled sour to something earthier, more mushroomy, like forest floor after rain. That shift in smell is one of the most reliable indicators that your compost is transitioning correctly. It's the photorophic bacteria completing their cycle and the fungal community beginning its own work. By the end of week 2, or the beginning of week 3, you may see fine white threads, mycelium again, threading through the material in the soil factory. This is your signal that the humification process is actively occurring. Dig a small handful and smell it. If it smells like rich earth, specifically like that clean, mineral wet smell that rises from good forest soil after rain, you're done. That smell has a name, petrichor, produced by actinomycetes bacteria, and it's one of the oldest indicators of healthy soil in every agricultural tradition that ever took it seriously. Connect what you're smelling back to what I described in the beginning. That dark, crumbly material you've created from your kitchen waste, that's the baseline that your grandfather's soil had before the fertilizer era rewrote the rules. The difference is, you made it in 2 weeks, from things you were throwing away, for roughly the cost of the salt you'd put on your food. What does it look like when you use it? The first time I applied finished bokashi compost to my tomato bed, a bed that had been struggling with clay-heavy, compacted soil for 2 seasons, the change in the plants was visible within 10 days. Not dramatic Hollywood growth. Real change. Leaf color shifted from a slightly anemic green to a deeper, more saturated tone that anyone who's grown tomatoes long enough would recognize as vigorous health. New growth was thicker. The root zone, when I pulled a struggling plant to compare against an untreated one, was denser and branched more extensively. The mycorrhizal network, the fungal threads that connect plant roots to soil nutrients, was visibly more developed around the treated plant's roots. That's not a claimed benefit. That's what I saw, in my bed, in my soil. Here's what I want you to understand about why this matters beyond your garden. Every time you seal a bin instead of a bag, every time you turn kitchen waste into something living rather than something buried under 40 feet of landfill, you're participating in a system that is older than civilization and more sophisticated than anything made in a chemical plant. You're not just composting, you're restoring. You're choosing, 1 week at a time, to put something back into the soil instead of extracting from it endlessly and hoping the bag makes up the difference. The knowledge we've been talking about today wasn't lost. It was always there, in Korean farming journals, in Japanese smallholder practice, in the work of Han-Kyu Cho, and the researchers who validated his methods decades later. It survived because the soil always remembers, even when the people forget. Share this with someone who still tosses their peels and grounds into the bin every morning, because what they're throwing away is exactly what the earth has been asking for. And if you want to go even deeper, if you want to see what happens when this bokashi system gets combined with a centuries-old growing method that was essentially erased by colonial agricultural policy across 3 continents, that's the next video. And it involves a technique so counterintuitive that when I first read about it, I thought it was completely wrong. It wasn't. It was just old enough that nobody thought to teach it anymore. Subscribe, because what we're doing here isn't just gardening. We're unearthing what the industry spent decades making easy to forget.